Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into scratchy wool tunics, stepping onto muddy cobbled streets and heading straight for the village oven. The air is thick with wood smoke and the yeasty tang of something that looks like bread. Though, spoiler alert, it might contain sand, beans, or just a whole lot of regret. You're standing in a medieval bakery, and what's on offer depends entirely on your social rank, your grain quota, and whether you've annoyed the miller lately. You're about to discover the many shades of bread, and why none of them are quite what you'd call appetizing today. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Drop that in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're clutching a piece of coarse, dark bread. It's tough, chewy, and slightly gritty. That's not flour clumping, it's actual grit. See, bread in the Middle Ages wasn't the fluffy, crusty bakery dream we picture today. It was often made from a mix of whatever grains were around. Barley, rye, oats, and sometimes even peas or beans ground into a lumpy flour. The lower your social status, the weirder and rougher your loaf. Peasants typically ate maslin, a mixture of cheaper grains baked into thick, dark loaves that could double as weapons in a pinch. The richer folk, of course, preferred fine white bread called manchet, made from well-sifted wheat flour. It was soft, delicate, and largely inaccessible to you if you didn't own at least one field and two serfs. But here's a fun twist. Millstones used to grind flour wore down over time. Tiny flakes of stone would end up in the dough. So yes, if you lived to 40 with your teeth intact, you were either lucky or toothless from munching sediment-filled slices your whole life. Dentists? Not exactly a booming profession. And you didn't just eat bread, you used it as a utensil. Trenchers were thick slabs of stale bread used as edible plates. After a meal, these grease-soaked bases were either eaten, tossed to beggars, or fed to dogs. Historians still argue whether this practice was more hygienic or just a creative way to avoid doing dishes. Then there's the communal baking ordeal. If you were a peasant without your own oven, and most were, you'd prepare your dough at home and haul it to the village bakehouse. The communal oven, operated by the lord's appointed baker, was not free. You paid a banal fee, which sounds quaint but stung if your harvest had been poor. Oh, and forget about sneaking a side batch in. Bakers often marked loaves with family symbols or slashes to keep things honest. The nobles had it better. Of course, they had access to professional bakers, better ingredients, and private ovens. They were also deeply obsessed with appearances. White bread symbolized purity and class. It didn't necessarily taste better, it just looked refined. You know, the medieval version of Instagrammable brunch. But even the nobility didn't always get it right. Monks, for example, often baked bread as part of their humble labor, and some abbey records suggest rather inconsistent results. Imagine biting into a spiritual reflection of humility that tastes like burned peerage. Still, bread was life. A meal without bread wasn't considered a meal at all. There are records of people mourning more over lost bread than spoiled meat. Bread also played a key role in tithes, taxation, and religious rituals. In a way, bread was currency, comfort food, and culinary roulette, all rolled into one. And if you're thinking, okay, but at least they had sourdough, right? Well, sort of. Leavening was unpredictable. People relied on wild yeast, often from ale fermentation. That means your loaf could rise beautifully or turn into a damp brick, depending on the mood of invisible microbes. It was like baking with ghosts. By now, you're chewing slowly, cautiously, imagining that stony crunch in your molars. The bread is dry but surprisingly filling. You've walked miles, worked a field, and this humble slice is the thing keeping you upright. It's not glamorous, but it's dependable. Just don't smile too wide. Your molars probably didn't make it past last winter. You're waking up to the smell of damp straw and maybe a pig rooting around a little too close to your head. The sun hasn't fully crested the hills yet, and already the village is stirring. Time for breakfast, but don't get too excited. There's no sizzling bacon, no steaming coffee, no stack of pancakes. Instead, you're handed a clay cup of something lukewarm and mildly suspicious. Weak ale. Yes, ale. For breakfast. You sip it slowly because honestly, there's nothing else. Water is not to be trusted. It's often polluted by both humans and livestock. Ale, even the weak stuff brewed for daily consumption, is safer. It's low in alcohol, sure, but it's been boiled, fermented, and blessed by years of cultural habit. Plus, it kind of takes the edge off the fact that your meal is a bowl of leftover pottage from 2 days ago. This is a world where cereal means gruel, a thin porridge of oats or barley, sometimes thickened with stale bread. Maybe there's a dab of animal fat stirred in, or a few sad onions if you're lucky. It's warm, bland, and gently disheartening. Still, it fills the stomach, which is the entire goal. Flavor is optional. Meanwhile, your noble counterparts are enjoying a dramatically different start to the day. In a castle somewhere not too far from your smoky hovel, a well-dressed lord is tucking into white bread with butter, a slab of cheese, and slices of cold roast meat left over from last night's feast. Maybe even honey. Maybe fruit. Possibly even a songbird pastry if his cook got ambitious. The contrast is not subtle. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants were truly malnourished or just nutritionally bored. On paper, they had calories, just not many vitamins, and certainly not much variety. And given the heavy labor most peasants endured, your breakfast needs to do more than just sit there. It needs to work. Enter the second breakfast. That's right. Long before hobbits made it cute, medieval workers practiced the original energy refueling routine. Around mid-morning, after a few hours of labor, you might break for more ale and another slice of bread or cheese, if available. You might even gnaw on a cold onion, because what's better than onion breath when yelling across a field? Let's talk about the ale again, because you're still sipping it, and the flavor is interesting. Medieval ale was different from today's beer. It was unfiltered, uncarbonated, and didn't keep long. It was brewed with local yeast and often flavored with herbs like bog myrtle or yarrow instead of hops. Hops didn't take off until later, and even then, some English towns banned them as a wicked weed. So your breakfast ale is slightly sour, slightly cloudy, and just the right strength to keep your legs moving without knocking you into the barley. And yes, even children drank it. Not because medieval parents were reckless, but because clean water was basically a fantasy. The weak ale served to children and laborers was called small beer, and it had less alcohol than mouthwash but still killed enough bacteria to be considered safe. Back at your table, well, your wooden slab with 3 legs, you might be joined by your family or maybe not. Meals weren't always communal, especially for workers. You eat quickly without ceremony. There's no concept of breakfast being the most important meal of the day, just the first chance to eat something before your arms fall off. In wealthier homes, breakfast had more structure, but still no waffles. Nobles often treated breakfast more like a snack, especially on feast days when the real culinary flex came at lunch. But they might start with warmed wine, sweet buns, and preserved fruits. Think of it as the medieval version of a continental breakfast, if your continent was filled with sword fights and damp stone walls. And while the idea of brunch didn't exist, monks and nuns had their own rhythms. Their meals were regulated by bells, not hunger, and often began with a subdued procession to a chilly refectory where silence was expected. And the food was, well, godly but not exciting. Porridge, bread, water, and maybe ale if the abbot was feeling lenient. You scrape the bottom of your bowl. There's a crusty bit that might have been oats or might have been yesterday's supper reincarnated. You eat it anyway. Waste not, want not. You glance at the jug, still some ale left. Lucky you. Breakfast in the Middle Ages wasn't just about eating. It was about endurance. It was about facing the day ahead with the full awareness that you'd be hungry again in 2 hours and that your next meal might not be much better. Still, as you pull on your rough-spun tunic and step out into the chill morning air, that humble meal of ale and mush has done its job. You're upright, you're moving, and you've got just enough fuel to plow a field, fetch water, or chase a runaway pig through the village square. Maybe it wasn't fancy, maybe it wasn't delicious, but it was breakfast, and in the Middle Ages, that was enough. Your stomach's no longer grumbling, but let's not pretend it's satisfied. By midday, the ache returns. You're halfway through mucking out a field, and now it's time to dream of lunch, or, as they might have called it, dinner. Yes, the midday meal was the main event of the day, especially if you were a peasant burning calories like firewood. So you trudge home, wiping your hands on your tunic, past neighbors doing the same, past pigs nosing through mud, and toward the promise of pottage. Again. You knew it was coming. A bubbling, brownish stew, always waiting in a pot, always slightly different and slightly the same. No one really knows how long it's been cooking. Days, possibly. It absorbs everything. Vegetables, grains, bits of meat if you're lucky, and sometimes things that fall in accidentally. It's like edible history. Pottage is the medieval answer to fast food, except it's slow, and no one's entirely sure what's in it. You ladle some into a wooden bowl. Today's version includes cabbage, parsnips, and something chewy. Could be bacon, could be bark. Honestly, you don't ask anymore, and yet it's everything. This humble stew was the backbone of medieval diets across Europe, especially for the lower classes. Nutrient-rich, versatile, and endlessly stretchable, it kept families fed through hard winters and poor harvest. Its base was usually some grain, barley, oats, or spelt, thickened with root vegetables and whatever herbs grew wild nearby. Now look across the field to the manor house. The noble family is dining in their great hall, seated at a long table covered in a linen cloth. Their meal is something else entirely. Roasted meats, white bread, pies filled with eels or cherries, and elaborate sauces thickened with almonds or egg yolks. A servant stands by with a water basin, because cleanliness and status go hand in hand. You wiped your hands on your sleeve and prayed no one noticed the pig bite. Feasts were political, performative, and often absurd. A lord might serve a roasted peacock dressed in its own feathers just to show off. But these feasts weren't daily occurrences. They were reserved for holidays, weddings, or visits from someone important enough to warrant using the good trenchers. Most of the time, even nobles lived on simpler fare: bread, meat, cheese, and ale. Lots of ale. And let's not romanticize peasant diets too much. While some historians claim that medieval peasants ate more vegetables than we do today, they also faced chronic shortages of protein and essential vitamins. That means your lunchtime stew might fill your belly but leave you with scurvy teeth and creaky joints by age 35. Historians still argue whether the average peasant's diet was healthier than ours today. Some say it was surprisingly balanced during good harvest years. Others point to the famine records and sky-high infant mortality rates. Context is everything, and so is rainfall. Of course, the actual content of your lunch depended hugely on geography and season. In the warmer months, you'd see more fresh greens: spinach, leeks, sorrel, wild garlic. In colder months, dried peas, onions, beans, and preserved root vegetables. Sometimes salted fish if you were near a coast. Sometimes salted anything. When there's no refrigeration, you get creative. But here's your quirky twist of the day. In parts of medieval England, people believed that eating too much lettuce could cause melancholy. Imagine that. Taking one look at your salad and thinking, better not, might get too sad. Meanwhile, garlic was thought to ward off evil spirits, and onions were valued for both flavor and supposed medicinal power. Your lunch today probably includes both, just in case. And what about meat? Well, unless it's a feast day or you've been very lucky snaring rabbits, probably not. Meat was expensive, heavily taxed, and tightly regulated. If you hunted game on the Lord's land without permission, you could be fined, or worse. So most peasants got their protein from beans, lentils, and the occasional egg. If you did eat meat, it was often pork, preserved in salt or smoked for long-term storage. Think chewy bacon jerky with medieval flair. Now, here comes your second drink of the day. More ale. Maybe a stronger brew this time, because the sun is high and the work is hard. You raise your mug to the sky, take a swig, and pretend not to notice the sediment at the bottom. Cheers. In town, you'd see vendors selling hot pies, cheese, or freshly baked bread. Markets bustled with options, if you had money. A wedge of cheese here, a cured sausage there, dried apples wrapped in cloth. But if you lived in the countryside like most people, your lunch came from your land, your animals, or your luck with wild herbs. And as you mop up the last of your pottage with a ragged slice of bread, you glance toward the manor again. Somewhere in there, someone is being served a spiced fruit tart, or perhaps a capon swimming in almond milk sauce. But you've got warm stew, a breeze, and a bit of onion stuck in your teeth. And somehow, it's enough. You're chewing slowly now, hoping whatever that stringy bit was didn't once neigh or oink or bark. Meat, when it showed up on your plate in the Middle Ages, was a rare and welcome visitor, unless, of course, you were a noble, in which case it was practically your identity. For the average peasant, though, meat was like a celebrity sighting. Thrilling, unexpected, and usually over too fast. Let's take a stroll through the butcher's logic. First off, if you were poor, animals weren't food. They were assets. Chickens laid eggs, pigs got fat off scraps, cows gave milk, and sheep provided wool. To eat one was to lose an income stream, unless it was old, sick, or you'd hit a rough patch. So yes, that mystery meat might very well be a retired hen who lost the will to cluck. And when you did get meat, it was often heavily salted, smoked, or stewed for hours to make it chewable. The idea of tender, seared, medium rare anything? Absolutely not. You boiled it. You boiled everything. Why? Because it was safer, easier, and, let's be honest, you probably only had one pot anyway. Now shift the camera to the noble's table again. It's a scene straight out of a medieval Instagram feed. Roasted boar with gilded apples in its mouth, pigeons arranged in pastry shells shaped like castles, and, wait for it, hedgehog stew. That's right, hedgehog. Some medieval recipe books included instructions for cooking them after removing the spines, usually by rolling the little guy in dough. Supposedly cute, definitely crunchy. And yet, despite appearances, even rich folks had their limits. Eating exotic or heavily spiced meats was more about display than delight. The more foreign the spice, the more expensive the dish, the more refined the diner. But historians still argue whether these meals were actually enjoyed or simply endured as status flexes. Meat also came with rules. So many rules. Church law dictated meatless days, sometimes up to 3 days a week, plus every Friday, plus Lent. That meant a third of the year or more was off limits for flesh. But don't worry. Clever medieval minds found loopholes. Beaver tail? Counted as fish? Puffins? Fish? Barnacle geese, which supposedly grew from driftwood and never touched land? Definitely fish. You had to admire the theological creativity. And let's not forget the symbolism. Meat wasn't just food, it was hierarchy. Nobles had hunting rights and served game to show power. Kings gifted venison as political favors. Peasants? They poached, illegally, and risked serious punishment. Stealing a deer could lead to the stocks or worse, depending on your timing and how well you begged. Your most likely meat, if you got any, was pork. Pigs were surprisingly resilient and happy to eat just about anything, including refuse. They were the garbage collectors of the medieval village, snuffling through waste and growing fat for winter. When one was slaughtered, the event was communal. Every part was used: blood, organs, fat, feet. Blood pudding, tripe stew, jellied trotters. Nothing was wasted, and certainly nothing was Instagram-worthy. Quirky tidbit time. Some medieval doctors believed different meats influenced your mood. Beef was said to make you sluggish, rabbit made you timid, and venison made you noble. It was part of the theory of the four humors, where everything you ate was linked to bodily fluids and personal temperament. So, if your dinner made you grumpy, it wasn't the overcooked badger. It was probably your black bile acting up, Now, as you pull out a sliver of bone from your stew and sigh, think about how animals were more than food. They were also medicine. A cooked hare's brain was believed to cure epilepsy. A boiled wolf's liver? Great for digestion. Not that you'd want to test it, but when choices are limited and science hasn't quite arrived, imagination fills in the blanks. Of course, medieval towns had their own meat markets, complete with sound, smells, and butchers who could gut a pig in 10 seconds flat. The cleanliness of these places varied wildly. Sometimes the stench drove even hardened traders away. Flies were frequent customers, and butchers weren't shy about flinging scraps into the street. And then there's feast day excess. Imagine sitting through a banquet where every dish was an animal, stuffed with another animal, stuffed with another animal. Yes, Torducken has medieval roots. A 15th century English feast once featured a roasted swan, stuffed with a goose, then a chicken, then a pigeon. The effect was theatrical. But back in your reality, you're sucking marrow from a greasy knucklebone, grateful for the calories. The flavors are basic: salt, onion, smoke, but familiar. You chew slowly, your jaw tired from the work, and your mind drifting into a slow food coma. Your belly for now is warm, so could you stomach it? Maybe not every day, but in a world where meat was rare, rules were many, and nothing was wasted, you wouldn't say no to a scrap, even if it still had feathers. It's Friday. That means no meat. Not because you're vegetarian, but because the church says so. And in the Middle Ages, when the church holds the rule book, you follow it, or risk eternal consequences, or at least a scolding from your parish priest. So you sigh, set aside thoughts of pork or pigeon pie, and turn your hungry attention to the fish. But not just any fish. You're in a landlocked village, so forget ocean fare. Today, it's eels again. Or maybe dried herring if the merchant remembered to stop by. Your neighbor is already soaking some salt cod in a pot to soften it. And your family, you're headed to the stream to see if your luck with the net is better than last week, when all you caught was a curious frog and some disappointment. This was life under the long reach of medieval fasting. The church dictated fish days, which were essentially not meat days, covering Wednesdays, Fridays, and the entirety of Lent. That's over 150 days a year. And since dairy also counted as meaty, you often found yourself in a culinary twilight zone. No meat, no butter, no milk, no eggs. Just fish, grains, and the occasional grumble. But medieval cooks got crafty. They leaned into the fish market, fresh, dried, salted, pickled, smoked. Every region had its go-tos. In Northern Europe, herring was king. In southern regions, anchovies and sardines ruled. If you lived near rivers or lakes, you might see carp, trout, or eels, slippery little creatures that could be baked into pies, roasted on spits, or boiled into stews. They were rich, fatty, and surprisingly popular. Eel pies, by the way, were a delicacy of sorts. In some towns, they were made into ornate pastry sculptures that looked like serpents or dragons. The taste? Earthy, oily, slightly alarming. But they kept you full and in the church's good graces. And now for a quirky twist, beavers. Yes, beavers. Because they lived in water and had scaly tails, some clerics ruled them to be honorary fish. So, on fasting days, medieval folk in some regions happily tucked into roast beaver without spiritual guilt. Historians still argue whether this was genuine theology or just creative hunger. Barnacle geese were another fun workaround. There was a medieval belief, especially in parts of Ireland and Scotland, that barnacle geese didn't hatch from eggs like boring terrestrial birds, but instead spontaneously grew from driftwood or sea foam. Because of this oceanic origin story, they too were deemed fish-like, and thus fair game on meatless days. If that sounds absurd, well, it was. But the church didn't always push back. And while we're navigating these fishy loopholes, let's visit the monasteries. Monks were especially bound to fasting rules, yet they had resources and time to experiment. They developed intricate meat-free menus that could rival any modern vegan restaurant. Almond milk stews, herbed grain cakes, and fish cooked with vinegar and spices. They even made fake eggs out of crushed almonds and colored them with herbs. Commitment, thy name is monk. You sit by your own fire now, watching fish bubble in a pot. The smell is strong, pungent, sour, a little salty. Your fingers are sticky with brine. This isn't exactly fine dining, but you're grateful. The fish is a success. You'll break off bits of flatbread, dip them into the broth, and chew in thoughtful silence. Not everyone could afford fish regularly, even on fasting days. That's where pottage stepped in again. This time with lentils, leeks, and a splash of vinegar to pretend it has some flavor. Pickled vegetables helped, as did herbs like parsley, sage, and garlic. If your village had a communal garden or access to wild greens, you'd gather nettles, sorrel, and whatever else didn't fight back too hard. Wealthy nobles, of course, fasted in style. They hosted lavish fish feasts, complete with sturgeon, lamprey, and shellfish. In one recorded case, a bishop celebrated Lent with a meal that included over 20 courses of seafood. So yes, they followed the rules, but with oysters and wine. Yet the church didn't invent these dietary restrictions just to be difficult. Fasting was seen as a form of discipline, a spiritual reset. It reminded people to reflect, to simplify, to consider the poor. Whether or not everyone internalized that message is another story. Now let's not forget the drink. With no milk or cream allowed, almond milk reigned supreme. This was made by grinding almonds with water, straining the mixture, and using it in everything from stews to porridges. It was more expensive than regular dairy, but technically allowed. You sip some now. It's watery, slightly gritty, and nothing like what's in your modern latte. The fire pops. The last bits of fish are gone. Your belly is pleasantly heavy with food that followed all the rules, even if it didn't excite your taste buds. You've survived another fasting day, and maybe you even feel holier for it. Or maybe you just miss bacon. The sun dips lower and dinner's still hours away, so you pass the time sorting lentils, scraping crust from the pot, and daydreaming about spices. Not because you've ever tasted them, unless you were unusually lucky, but because everyone talks about them. The merchant at the market whispers about saffron like it's treasure. Your neighbor once claimed she smelled cinnamon. And the village priest says frankincense tastes like heaven, though no one's sure if he's confusing it with incense. Spices in the Middle Ages weren't just seasonings, they were statements. They were prestige, wealth, medicine, and mystery rolled into one. Imagine someone walking into your cottage with a pinch of clove and dropping it in your soup. That would be like pouring truffle oil on instant noodles today. Both thrilling and faintly ridiculous. You sniff the air, but all you detect is boiling cabbage. Still, you can't help but imagine the world beyond your fields. Spices came from far. Pepper from India, cinnamon from Sri Lanka, nutmeg from the Banda Islands, saffron from the Middle East. It's not just the flavors that blew people's minds, it was the sheer improbability of these things arriving in your stew at all. The silk routes and spice caravans didn't pass through your village, of course. They ran through empires and deserts, across oceans and kingdoms, and the further a spice had traveled, the more valuable it became. By the time black pepper arrived at a noble's table, it cost more than gold by weight. Imagine that. Something that made you sneeze also made you rich. For peasants, spices were rare visitors. Maybe once a year at a feast day, a traveling cook added a whiff of cumin or ginger. Maybe the Lord's kitchen tossed the remnants of a feast to the village and someone licked a clove. But in daily life, your flavors were local. Onions, leeks, garlic, mustard seeds, wild herbs. You made do, but you still dreamed. Nobles, on the other hand, didn't just eat spices, they flaunted them. A dish with multiple spices wasn't just tasty, it was a power move. It said, I have ships, trade partners, and coins to burn. Spices were used in everything. Meat, fish, wine, desserts, even medicines. Feeling faint? Try some nutmeg. Tummy ache? Mix cinnamon with honey. Heartbreak? Saffron and wine. And then there's the cooking technique of the era. More is more. Medieval chefs believed in bold flavors, complex combinations, and layering spices like medieval lasagna. Imagine fish cooked in almond milk with saffron, cloves, and vinegar. Not your usual Tuesday meal. Here's a quirky twist. Saffron wasn't just food, it was fashion. Wealthy diners used it to dye rice golden yellow, giving the illusion of opulence even when the ingredients were humble. The visual alone was part of the meal. You weren't just eating, you were watching yourself eat in style. Historians still argue whether spices were primarily used to cover the taste of spoiled meat. The myth persists, but most experts say no. If you could afford saffron, you could afford fresh meat. Spices weren't deodorant, they were decoration. In your own home, you might rely on poor man's spice. Vinegar. Sharp, pungent, and easy to make, vinegar added brightness to your dullest stews. Sometimes you'd steep herbs in it. Parsley, thyme, maybe some dried rose petals, and call it a sauce. It worked most of the time. Sort of. Still, the fascination with exotic spices never left the medieval imagination. Entire wars were fought over nutmeg. Trade alliances rose and fell over cloves. And entire fortunes were made by men who risked their lives to bring back a bag of peppercorns. And here's a grim aside. Spices also became part of death. Cloves and cinnamon were often packed into the body cavities of nobles to mask odors during burial. If you smelled spicy in the afterlife, chances were you died rich. Back to you. Tonight's dinner won't have any spices, you know that. But as you stir the pot and watch it bubble, you toss in a sprig of wild rosemary. It's not from the east, it's from your yard. But the smell rises with the steam, and for a moment, it feels like luxury. The light fades. The fields go quiet. You sip from a chipped mug of weak ale, and you imagine what pepper might taste like. Sharp? Warm? You're not sure, but you know this. If you ever got your hands on a pinch, you'd savor it like treasure. Maybe one day the merchant will have extra. Maybe next feast, the Lord's kitchen will be feeling generous. Until then, you've got rosemary and vinegar, and just enough imagination to carry the flavor through. The stew simmers, a little thicker now, clinging to the spoon with the faint resistance of something that's been reheated 6 times. You lean in and breathe deep. There's onion, a trace of barley, a lot of fatigue, and soup. Again, always soup. If bread was the cornerstone of the medieval diet, soup, or more properly pottage, was its constant companion. It wasn't just a dish, it was a way of life. A bubbling pot of something was almost always on the fire, ready to feed whoever stumbled through the door with a wooden spoon and an empty stomach. And here's the thing, it never really stopped cooking. That pot? It stayed on the hearth, day and night. Bits were added, scooped out, thickened, watered down, then added again. This wasn't a recipe, it was a process. Today it might be peas, tomorrow barley, the next day a suspiciously tender turnip. Your soup was a living thing, changing slowly with the seasons, your mood and your luck in the garden. There's a reason for this eternal bubbling. Fires were sacred. If you were lucky enough to have one going, you didn't waste the heat. You cooked everything in that one pot. A single fireplace, one hanging cauldron, and a dream. And while you might think it sounds romantic, historians still argue whether this perpetual stew method was delicious or horrifying. One account from the 14th century describes a village stew that had been going for over a year, thick with meat juices and root vegetables, kept alive like sourdough, but wetter and significantly more opaque. Some towns even had community pots in the center of the village, especially during harsh winters. You'd bring what you could spare, an onion, a carrot, half a rabbit if you got lucky, and contribute to the common meal. It was charity, survival, and gossip all stirred together, but not all soups were humble. In noble kitchens, there were thick broths, called broths or sops, made by soaking fine white bread in spiced stock, and topping it with almond milk or grated cheese. These weren't your average peasant soups. They were creamy, rich and spooned into golden bowls while minstrels sang about dragons. And here's a quirky twist. Some medieval menus list blanc mange, a dish made from boiled chicken, rice, sugar, and almond milk. It was pale, mushy, and sometimes shaped into animals. A kind of medieval comfort food/art project. Children supposedly loved it. Adults tolerated it. No one really knew why it had to be white, but it always was. Back in your hut, your pottage thickens as the grains soften. You drop in a handful of wild herbs, thyme, maybe some chopped dandelion leaves. The flavor won't win awards, but it's warm, and that's what matters. You tear a hunk of yesterday's bread and dip it into the pot, letting the crust soak until it surrenders completely. Eating soup was practical. It used fewer utensils, no need for knives or elaborate place settings. A bowl, a spoon, your hands, and clean up. Minimal, leftovers, reboil. It was the meal that kept on giving, and giving, and giving. And on days when meat was scarce, which was most days, people turned to soup for substance. You could thicken it with oats, beans, or even crumbled bread. A truly desperate cook might toss in stale ale or vinegar to add depth. And if you were feeling luxurious, a sprinkle of salt, just a pinch. But let's not ignore the visual. Medieval soups were not pretty. No bright veggies floating in golden broth. No sprigs of parsley on top. They were brown or gray. Occasionally green in a worrying way, but they were hearty and they kept you alive. Monasteries took soup to an art form. It was their daily bread, sometimes quite literally. Some orders had recipes for specific fast days. Bean soup with leeks, barley stew with almond milk, thickened spinach soup with garlic. Silent meals were made easier by something that didn't require chewing or conversation. And then there were soups as medicine. A broth of boiled parsnips and fennel was said to cure melancholy. Garlic soup revived the weary. Leek and mustard stew? Great for the lungs, apparently. The line between dinner and doctor was always blurry. Now you sit back, bowl in hand, the fire casting warm light across the wooden floor. You slurp slowly, feeling the grainy texture coat your tongue. It's not glamorous, but there's comfort in routine. This is the meal you've had 100 times before, and will probably have 100 more. Soup is the great equalizer. Rich or poor, tired or busy, joyful or sad, everyone eats soup. And tonight your soup is enough. The pot's empty now, just a ring of crust clinging to the rim, and your stomach hums in that quiet, heavy way it does after a full meal. Not stuffed, but stable. You stretch, maybe yawn, and consider the next challenge. Keeping food edible until tomorrow. Welcome to the world of medieval food storage, where the goal was simple. Don't let it kill you. Without refrigerators, sealed containers, or much in the way of sterilization, medieval people had to get creative and occasionally superstitious about keeping food from spoiling. You glance at the corner of your cottage where a sack of oats hangs from the ceiling. That's intentional. Mice can't climb twine, but they'll absolutely gnaw through a bag on the floor. You've learned that one the hard way. Start with grains. Grains were life. Wheat, barley, rye, oats, all needed to be stored dry, cool, and out of reach. Granaries, large elevated sheds with slatted floors, were used by wealthier farmers. If you were poor, you stuffed sacks into corners, buried them in clay pots, or tucked them into barrels lined with straw. Sometimes herbs like mint or tansy were thrown in as natural bug repellents. Did it work? Historians still argue. But it smelled nice. Then there's meat. If you had some, your first thought wasn't, how do I cook this? It was, how do I make this last until winter? The solution? Salt. So much salt. Entire slabs of pork were packed in barrels and layered with it, until they resembled something between jerky and a medieval salt lick. You'd soak it in water for days before eating, changing the water daily just to make it chewable. Smoking was another option. Hang your meat in the rafters above your hearth, and the rising smoke would dry it out and preserve it. Your house would smell like bacon for weeks, which was probably a nice side effect. If you didn't have meat, you might smoke fish or even cheese. Yes, cheese could be smoked, salted, dried, or wrapped in wax or cloth soaked in vinegar. Anything to keep the mold polite. Vegetables were trickier. Root vegetables like carrots, onions, turnips, and beets were stored in cellars. Dark, cool places that mimicked natural refrigeration. You'd layer them in sand or straw to prevent rot and pray the rats didn't stage a coup. Leafy greens, on the other hand, didn't keep well. You had to eat them fast or ferment them. Cabbage turned into sauerkraut, for instance, in surprisingly tasty ways. Here's a quirky tidbit. Butter could be stored in bogs. Yes, bogs. In Ireland especially, people buried barrels of butter in peat bogs, where the cool, anaerobic conditions preserved it for months, sometimes years. Some of it's even been dug up by archaeologists, still vaguely edible after 500 plus years. Would you eat it? Up to you, but it smells intense. Back to your kitchen, or what passes for one. You've got a shelf with hard cheese wrapped in cloth, some dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and a jar of pickled turnips on the table. Pickling was a lifesaver. Vinegar, salt brine, and thyme turned perishables into winter food. Cucumbers, onions, even eggs could be preserved this way. They weren't fresh, but they were safe. Monasteries had dedicated storage rooms, larders, which were cool and stone-lined. Some even had ice pits, where snow collected in winter was packed in sawdust and used to chill perishables. It's medieval refrigeration, but only if you had monks and money. And then there was drying. You'd slice apples and hang them from strings near the fire. Beans were left in the sun until they rattled in their pods. Peas and lentils were dried, stored in cloth sacks and tossed into soups all year. Simple, effective, and probably home to more than a few insects. But protein's protein, right? Some households used oils or fat to preserve food. Meat could be cooked and then sealed in a layer of its own fat, like a rustic version of confit. Butter, too, could be clarified and used to coat food. It wasn't delicious, but it worked, especially if you didn't mind your dinner looking like a candle. Now for dairy. Milk went bad fast. If you couldn't drink it that day, you turned it into something else. Butter, curds, or cheese. Cheese lasted weeks, even months, depending on how it was made. Richer households even had cheese presses, large wooden contraptions that squeezed the moisture out and helped extend shelf life. You press yours between two stones and hope for the best. And let's not forget honey. Honey was one of the few natural preservatives available, and it was excellent at it. Fruits preserved in honey could last all winter. Plus, it was delicious. If you ever got your hands on some, it was like eating sunlight. You'd hide it from the kids, maybe even from your spouse. You look around. Everything edible has its place. The fire has dimmed, casting flickers across the wall. You stretch and smile. It's not glamorous. But with a little planning and a lot of salt, you've managed to keep a bit of food between now and the next harvest. And that, in the Middle Ages, was a small miracle. You wake early, again, before the sun, before the roosters, before your joints are fully convinced they want to participate in the day. Your hands find bread in the dark, and you chew it half-conscious, but soon you're preparing for something more complex, a shared meal with others. It's not a feast, not even a holiday, but tonight the neighbors are gathering for stew and storytelling, which means table manners, or rather the medieval version of them. You're not setting out porcelain or polishing forks. In fact, forks aren't even part of the equation. If you did have one, people might look at you funny, or accuse you of being vaguely Italian and untrustworthy. In most of medieval Europe, forks were seen as overly dainty, even suspicious. You ate with your fingers, a knife, and maybe a spoon if soup was involved. That was it. And that knife, it's your personal knife. Everyone carried one. You didn't expect the host to provide cutlery. This wasn't a dinner party, it was survival with a side of socializing. You cleaned your blade on your sleeve and used it for everything. Cutting, scooping, spreading, maybe even defending your portion if someone got greedy. Plates, optional. If you were lucky, you ate from a wooden bowl. Otherwise, a slice of stale bread called a trencher served as your plate. These trenchers soaked up juices and grease from your food and were either eaten at the end, tossed to beggars, or thrown to the dogs. The phrase, soak it up, has never been more literal. And yes, seating mattered. If you were at a noble's table, where you sat showed your status. Closer to the Lord meant importance. Farther down the table, where the dishes arrived cold, meant you were just there to make the room feel fuller. Peasants had their own codes. Elders and honored guests got the good bowls. Kids sat on stools, if at all. You? You found a spot near the fire. Not because of rank, but because your back's sore and the warmth helps. Now, for the quirky part, hand washing was a thing. Before meals, servants would bring around a bowl and pitcher for guests to rinse their hands. At a noble table, this ritual was theatrical, sometimes scented with herbs or rosewater. Even among peasants, there was an understanding. Muddy fingers were for the field, not the bread. Still, the idea of hygiene was different. Your fingernails might be clean, but no one expects spotless clothes or hair. In fact, the lingering smell of smoke and onions was more common than offensive. Everyone smelled like something. Conversation at the table was encouraged, unless you were a monk, of course, in which case meals were eaten in silence while someone read aloud from scripture. But in regular homes, mealtimes were social. You'd hear tales of weather, livestock, bad harvests, and occasionally juicy gossip from the nearby market town. Someone might sing, someone might belch, and someone always knocked over the ale. Speaking of which, drinking vessels. You drank from wooden cups, horn goblets, or ceramic jugs. Glass was rare and fragile. You shared cups, passed them down the table, and tried not to backwash. Germ theory didn't exist, but manners did in their own sloshing, informal way. Historians still argue whether medieval etiquette was strict or relaxed. Some evidence points to rigid customs in noble circles. No elbows on the table, no reaching across, no talking with your mouth full. But among villagers and workers, it was more about practicality than polish. You didn't waste time on delicate manners when you had calluses and chores. Here's a detail you might not expect. Food wasn't always served individually. Large dishes were placed in the center and you helped yourself, or waited your turn. You tore bread, scooped from pots, and dipped fingers into shared bowls. Double dipping wasn't rude. It was survival. And sometimes meals became performances. At big feasts, entertainers might wander through the hall, jesters doing cartwheels between courses, minstrels singing about saints and scandals. Occasionally, a noble would stand and announce a gift. A pig, a cloak, a marriage contract. Not exactly your average dinner in a show, but it kept things lively. Back in your home, tonight's meal is quieter. The stew bubbles. Neighbors arrive carrying clay pots, crusty loaves, and their children. Everyone crams onto benches. The fire crackles. A wooden ladle makes its rounds. You all eat from the same pot, spoons clinking, laughter echoing, someone telling a half-true story about a merchant who traded his boots for a singing chicken. You wipe your fingers on a scrap of linen and lean back. The rules here aren't written down, they're just understood. Eat what's given, don't take the last bit unless invited, and always, always thank the cook. And as the pot empties and the stories wind down, someone pulls out a flute. Just a few notes, soft and wobbly. No concert. Just a reminder that even in a world of mud and hunger, someone still had time to learn music. You smile. Tonight the meal was more than food. It was warmth, company, a shared bowl, a shared joke, and one long, gentle exhale. You wake to a surprise. Fruit. Not much, just a single wrinkled apple someone left by the hearth. But it's enough to stop you in your tracks. In the Middle Ages, fruit wasn't a daily staple, it was a seasonal indulgence. And depending on where you lived, it was either a backyard miracle or a distant luxury. You pick it up, turn it in your hand, not shiny, not waxed, not the plump, uniform kind you find in modern supermarkets. It's small, uneven, and smells faintly sweet with a whiff of fermentation. Maybe it's slightly past its prime. But that's fine, it's still fruit. Fresh fruit was something people ate when it was there, which wasn't often. There were no year-round bananas or imported berries flown in from far-off lands. If it didn't grow near you, it didn't exist to you. Apples, pears, plums, cherries, these were common enough in temperate climates, but only when the season was right. And without refrigeration, your options came down to 3 words: eat it fast. The nobility had orchards, carefully cultivated trees bearing fruit for pies, preserves, and wines. These gardens weren't just practical, they were status symbols. If you had a pear tree, it said something. If you had an apricot tree, people talked. But here's your quirky twist. Medieval people were a bit suspicious of raw fruit. Some physicians believed that uncooked fruit was dangerous. It could upset your humors, cause fluxes, read unpleasant bathroom moments, or throw off your bodily balance. So fruit was often cooked, baked into pies, stewed into mush, or boiled down into sauces. Historians still argue whether this caution was based on actual health patterns or just medical overreach. Some believe the association came from bad storage practices. Fruit that had started to rot could cause illness, so cooking it made sense. Others think it was just part of the broader raw equals risky philosophy of the time. Meanwhile, dried fruit was a different story entirely. Raisins, figs, prunes, and dates were prized, especially by the upper classes. They were sweeter, easier to transport, and most importantly, they lasted. A handful of raisins could transform a bland pottage into a festive treat. If you had the coin. Then there were preserved fruits. Apples wrapped in straw, pears stored in cool cellars, cherries soaked in honey or vinegar. If you had sugar, rare, expensive, you might even candy citrus peels or make fruit jellies. But sugar wasn't common in your kitchen. More likely you relied on honey if you were lucky enough to know a beekeeper or be one. Monasteries grew fruit too, often with surprising variety. Monks documented how to graft apple trees, protect figs from frost, and grow mulberries for medicinal purposes. Some even made wine from wild berries, though the taste was often described as robust, which is monk speak for slightly aggressive. Let's not forget nuts. Technically not fruit, but often grouped together. Walnuts, hazelnuts, chestnuts, gathered in autumn, cracked open with stones or teeth, and eaten raw or ground into meal. Chestnuts were especially important in parts of France and Italy, where they were dried, ground into flour, and turned into porridge. A lifesaver during lean months, and here's a sweet detail. Some medieval celebrations involved fruit-based desserts, apple tarts, pear compotes, even fruit-stuffed pastries. For the rich, these dishes were laced with spices and decorated with gold leaf. For you, they were more modest. Apples baked in ash, sweetened with a drizzle of honey, and eaten with burnt fingertips and a smile. Now, back to your wrinkled apple. It's not perfect, but you slice it with your knife, eat the pieces slowly, and feel the crunch echo in the quiet. Sweetness spreads across your tongue, unexpected, nostalgic, comforting. The flavor lingers longer than you'd think, and for a moment you understand why fruit mattered so much. It wasn't just food. It was memory, reward, luxury, and nature's rare kindness all at once. You finish the last bite, careful not to waste the flesh near the core. You even consider drying the peels to use in tomorrow's stew. Because here, in this age, everything is used. Waste isn't just rude, it's foolish. Your stomach is warm, your hands are sticky, and your eyes drift toward the orchard on the hill. You wonder if the pears are ready yet, or if the birds beat you to them again. Either way, the promise of fruit is enough to make tomorrow feel brighter. The days are getting shorter now, and with the dusk comes the faint hope of something sweet. Not rich, not frosted, not the kind of dessert that arrives in neat slices, but medieval sweet things, humble and strange, born from whatever your kitchen can offer. You're not thinking of cake. You're thinking of boiled mush. With flair. You reach for your cupboard, really, just a shelf, and pull down the precious jar. Honey. Not much left. Just enough to add to something warm. In a world before sugar was common, honey was the ultimate sweetener. Bees were prized, their hives sometimes housed in tree trunks or wicker baskets. Beekeeping was serious business, and swarms were inherited in wills. That's how valuable honey was. So tonight you're making frumenti, a soft, grainy dish made from cracked wheat boiled in milk or water. For the wealthy, it might be flavored with saffron or spiced with cinnamon. For you, a spoon of honey and maybe a shaving of nutmeg from that dried sliver a peddler once traded for eggs. It's thick, golden, and gently sweet. Dessert. Medieval style. Now don't get confused. Desserts weren't daily events. They were more like rare guests that showed up on feast days, weddings, or big religious holidays. And even then, they weren't sugary in the modern sense. Instead, they leaned earthy and subtle. Think fruit cooked down into a thick paste and spread on bread. Or a custard made with almond milk and egg yolks, gently baked until it wobbled like a sleepy thought. One noble favorite was tarte de braille, an early cheesecake made from curd cheese, eggs, sugar if you had it, and a splash of rosewater. Served in flaky pastry, it was delicate and perfumed. You've never tasted it, but you've heard about it from the manor cook's niece, who claims it smells like flowers and dreams. Here's a quirky twist. Meat and sweets weren't always separate. One popular dish, mominy, mixed chicken or game meat with wine, spices, sugar, and almonds. It was served as a luxurious course at banquets, rich, confusing, and strangely delicious if you could afford it. Meat pie with a sweet twist? That was high-class dining. And what about drinks? Sweetened wine, if you had money. More likely, you'd make posset, a hot drink of milk curdled with ale or wine, thickened with breadcrumbs and sometimes sweetened with honey or dried fruit. It was comfort in a cup, especially in winter. Not everyone liked it. You tolerate it. Medieval cooks got very creative when sugar started to trickle into Europe via trade routes. They began candying nuts, making syrups, and even forming elaborate sugar sculptures. Some banquets featured entire table centerpieces made from spun sugar, castles, forests, ships. But for most people, sugar was an exotic fantasy. Honey was your go-to. Occasionally, fruit juice or mashed dates. A syrup made from boiled-down pears if you had time. Historians still argue whether the average peasant ever really experienced dessert. Some say yes on holy days or after successful harvests. Others suggest sweet dishes were exclusive to monasteries and noble courts. Either way, what counted as a treat was entirely different. A slice of toasted bread soaked in warm milk and honey could be someone's best meal of the week. Now you're stirring your frumenti slowly. It bubbles gently. The fire's dimmed, casting soft amber light. You spoon it into a bowl, add the honey, and sit by the hearth. The first bite is soft and sweet. Not cloying, just comforting. It melts into warmth on your tongue. You close your eyes, savor it, and think about how something so simple could feel so special. There's no second helping. That was the last of the honey for now. But it was worth it. A moment of pleasure, golden and fleeting, wrapped in steam and silence. You lick the spoon. Someone across the village is singing softly. A lullaby, maybe. Children giggle through the walls. Tomorrow there will be turnips and broth, but tonight there was dessert, and that's enough. Morning again. You stretch, glance at the cold hearth, and slip your shoes over feet still sore from yesterday's chores. There's no bacon frying, no flapjacks flipping. Just the sound of birds outside and the slow realization that if you want to eat today, you'd better go find it. Because when the garden's bare and the cupboard is echoing, it's time to forage. You grab your basket and head out past the fields, toward the forest's edge, where the real magic and occasional stomachache awaits. This isn't recreational foraging. This is survival. And you've learned a thing or two about which weeds won't make your belly regret its decisions. Welcome to the underappreciated world of edible weeds. Your meal today may be nettle soup again. Nettles sting, yes, but boiled in broth with barley or leeks. Surprisingly edible, packed with nutrients. And if your hands are quick or you have gloves, you'll avoid the worst of the sting. Then there's sorrel with its lemony tang and dandelion greens, bitter but bright. Wild garlic adds flavor. Chickweed goes into everything. If it grows and doesn't kill you, someone's probably tried it in a stew. Medieval peasants knew their flora intimately. It wasn't a hobby. It was the difference between dinner and hunger. You reach into a bush and pluck a handful of berries. Careful. Berries were trickier. Some nourished, some punished. Blackberries? Safe. Elderberries? Only when cooked. Deadly nightshade? A very different bedtime story. You nibble cautiously, the juice tart, staining your fingers. Here's a quirky twist. Acorns. Yes, the food of squirrels and, in hard times, humans. Peasants would gather acorns, leach the bitter tannins out in running water, and grind them into flour. Acorn bread was dense, slightly bitter, but better than nothing. In years of famine, it might be the only bread you got. Mushrooms? Now there's a gamble. Some edible, some fatal. If your grandmother didn't teach you which was which, you didn't touch them. Even monks kept mushroom charts, warning novices which caps led to visions and which led to other outcomes. Historians still argue whether foraging was seen as respectable or desperate. In some regions, skilled foragers were admired, like herbalists or wise women. In others, it was seen as peasant behavior, something you grew out of if you married well or had steady land. But even nobles dabbled in wild herbs. Many castle gardens featured physic plots where mint, sage, and fennel were grown for both taste and tonic. And what about protein? Well, if you were lucky or quick, you might catch something small. A rabbit, a bird, frogs, eels. Not hunted exactly, but gathered from nature with a snare or net. Even insects were fair game in some regions, though most people preferred to pretend otherwise. You pause by a patch of mint, pluck a few sprigs, and tuck them into your pouch. That'll freshen up the lentils later. A splash of vinegar and that mint might trick your tongue into thinking dinner is fancy. And let's not forget the forest floor's sweet surprise. Wild honey. Risky to harvest, but worth it. A hive in a hollow tree might yield a few golden spoonfuls if you can withstand the bees, the climb, and the neighbor who says the bees are his. Medieval bee disputes were real and sometimes violent. Then there's gleaning. Walking the fields after harvest to pick up leftover grain or vegetables. It was allowed by law in some places, forbidden in others. Peasants might slip into fields at dusk, hoping not to be seen, gathering just enough to stretch the pot one more night. You return home now, basket full, not overflowing but promising. Nettles, herbs, a few greens, and maybe a mushroom you think is safe. Tonight's soup will be familiar. Bitter, green, but healthy. You stir it slowly, thinking about how every plant has a season, a place, a memory. Your grandmother called nettles spring's pennies, humble but valuable. Your father swore by dandelions for his joints. Your aunt used to make wine from elderflowers, sweet and cloudy and gone too fast. You sip the soup. It's sharp, earthy, not unpleasant. And as you eat, you feel a strange pride. Not in what's in the bowl, but in knowing how to get it. Foraging wasn't just food. It was knowledge, passed down by touch and taste and trial. A map in your mind, a memory in your muscles. And tonight, like every night, that map has brought you home. The bell tolls faintly in the distance. You're not in your cottage now. You're walking up the long gravel path toward the stone archway of a monastery. The air smells of damp stone, candle wax, and boiled leeks. Tonight, you're dining with monks. Or rather, you're observing them dine. Because in this world, meals are not loud, bustling affairs. They are quiet, holy, almost theatrical in their silence. You remove your hat, lower your eyes, and step into the refectory, a large hall where long wooden tables stretch the length of the room. High above beams cradle hanging lanterns. The walls are cold, but the space has a reverent warmth to it. Everything here is ritual. You take your place. Not a seat exactly. Guests stand or kneel. The monks enter in a slow, deliberate procession. Heads bowed, robes swishing, no one speaks. A designated brother stands at a podium at the far end of the room, already preparing to read aloud as everyone else eats. It might be scripture. It might be a sermon on humility. Or a scolding story about a monk who once ate too fast and had indigestion for a week. Then the meal begins. It's not luxurious. You're served a portion of pottage. Surprise. With lentils, onions, and a slice of coarse bread. A cup of watered wine or ale accompanies it, though water is more likely. There may be a second dish, leeks with herbs or peas in a thin broth, and if it's a feast day or a Sunday, you might even get a bit of fish. But no one talks about it. No one talks at all. Silence here is sacred. In many monastic orders, especially the Benedictines, meals were meant to nourish the body while freeing the mind for contemplation. Talking during meals was discouraged or outright forbidden. If you needed to communicate, you used hand gestures. Imagine trying to ask for more salt with a pantomime. And here's a quirky twist. Some monasteries had a talking room called a parlor, where monks were allowed to speak for brief periods during the day. Meals were not that time. So if someone choked on a pea, there might be a brief, dignified moment of chaos before returning to the sacred hush. Monks ate according to strict schedules. Breakfast, often skipped entirely, was replaced by a single midday meal, then a light supper in the early evening. During Lent or on fast days, the evening meal was reduced to the barest minimum, or omitted altogether. You never complained. Complaining wasn't just impolite, it was ungrateful. You take a spoonful of the lentils, they're overcooked. The leeks have collapsed into themselves. There's no salt. You imagine this was intentional. Flavor distracts, simplicity purifies. The bread is hard, the ale is flat. Still, it fills you. The warmth spreads through your chest. Your stomach stops whispering. Historians still argue whether monastic food was truly meager or simply humble. Many monasteries had rich farmland, donated vineyards, and skilled cooks. Their food, while plain, could be quite nourishing, but excess was frowned upon. Even fish was subject to internal debate. Was eel really humble? What about oysters? Now, don't think these monks lacked culinary knowledge. Monastic records contain some of the most detailed recipe collections from the period, pottage variations, fish sauces, almond milk techniques. They understood nutrition in their own way. They just chose to limit pleasure. And yet, even here, exceptions crept in. Visitors, like you, might be served slightly better fare. A soft cheese, a poached pear. It was hospitality, a way to honor your presence while still keeping within their vows. There's a story about one abbot who insisted on fasting but secretly added meat stock to the communal soup. When questioned, he replied that it was spiritually humble but physically effective. A loophole, in other words. Tonight, no such loophole is evident. The second course arrives boiled barley with a dab of pickled turnip. Still no salt, still no talking. But the monk reading at the podium begins a story about a saint who once fed a starving family with a single radish. It's oddly comforting. You chew slowly, mindful of the silence, the candlelight flickering on worn faces, the subtle cough of the monk at the far end who always finishes early. A bell chimes, the meal is over. Everyone rises in unison. The bowls are collected. The monks bow and exit silently, returning to their dormitories, their prayers, their studies. You remain seated a moment longer. The room is still. Your breath fogs gently in the cool air, and in that stillness you feel something rare. A kind of peace. Maybe it's the simplicity, or the silence, or the barley. You stand, stretch, and thank your quiet host with a nod. In this world, food isn't celebration. It's function and discipline and occasionally grace. You've returned from the monastery, stomach steady, mind calm, but body unsettled. It starts as a cramp, then a gurgle, then a sharp twist that suggests your lentils may have had ulterior motives. You sit near the hearth, wrap yourself in a blanket, and consider your options. Because now, in the absence of modern medicine and a helpful pharmacist, you must navigate the strange world of medieval stomach remedies. First thought, charcoal. Not the kind you grill with, but the powdered remains of burnt bread. Some swore by it. Crushed and stirred into water, it was said to draw out bad humors. Of course it tasted like regret, but if it worked, you drank it. No complaints. You dig around your storage box and find a scrap of dried mint. Mint tea, basic but promising. You steep it in hot water, hoping for relief. Meanwhile, someone down the lane is boiling a mixture of vinegar, crushed garlic, and, if your nose isn't deceiving you, onion skin. You sincerely hope it's a poultice and not a soup. In the Middle Ages, digestion was more philosophy than biology. Most believed in the four humors theory: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was caused by imbalances. A stomachache? Likely too much cold and wet inside you. The fix? Warm, dry things like pepper, ginger, or boiled wine. Or mustard seeds soaked in vinegar and wrapped in cloth and tied to your navel. Yes, that was a thing. Here's a quirky twist. One common remedy was a roasted mouse. Yes, a whole mouse, singed, mashed with herbs, and sometimes administered as a poultice. Or, in more unfortunate cases, eaten. Mice were believed to carry earthy qualities that balanced upset stomachs. You decide to pass. More pleasant options included herbal mixtures, fennel seeds for gas, chamomile for bloating, dill for nausea. Some were genuinely effective, others less so. A 14th century manuscript recommends boiled chicken water mixed with ash and honey. Another suggests powdered deer antler. Unless you're a noble with access to powdered deer antler, you're probably sticking with mint. Historians still argue whether medieval medicine was more effective than we give it credit for. Some remedies bordered on modern herbalism. Others were dangerously speculative. And then there were the rituals. Saying prayers over bread, or wearing a blessed charm near your belly. Did it work? Maybe. Maybe belief was part of the cure. Monasteries doubled as hospitals with monks trained in rudimentary medicine. They kept gardens full of physic herbs, sage, rue, angelica, horehound. If you lived near one, you might get a tonic. If not, your neighbor might offer you a swig of something cloudy in a reused ale bottle. Another peculiar cure involved lying with a warm stone on your belly. Not bad, actually. The warmth soothed cramps, and if you added lavender or thyme, the scent helped too. At the very least, it made the house smell less like boiled leeks. For more persistent issues, there were purges. Laxatives ranged from prunes soaked in vinegar to more alarming solutions like rhubarb root and mercury. Yes, mercury, not ideal. But in a world with no germ theory, flushing out your insides was sometimes considered the best way forward. You shift uncomfortably just thinking about it. Vomiting was also encouraged, under the belief that expelling spoiled food was cleansing. Some even induced it with feather tickling. You, however, prefer to sip your tea and hope the mint does its job. As the cramps ease a little, you lie back and watch the fire flicker. You're grateful for the calm, even if you suspect round 2 is coming later. Your neighbor once said that if you dreamed of fish, it meant the spirits of your stomach were fighting. You didn't believe her, but last night's eel pie was suspicious. Still, as unpleasant as illness could be, the community always rallied. Someone would check in. Someone would bring soup. Maybe even a monk with a jar of rosewater and a serious expression. You close your eyes, breathing slowly, letting the mint work. And despite it all, the pain, the strange advice, the possibility of a mouse poultice, you feel cared for. In a way that transcends ingredients and instruction. Tomorrow you'll feel better. You'll walk the fields, you'll eat pottage. But tonight you simply rest, wrapped in warmth, sipping bitterness from a chipped mug, and whispering thanks to whatever herbs soothed you most. You wake up feeling better, lighter, clearer, and ever so slightly braver. Your stomach is quiet, your limbs are loose, and you're even thinking about food again. Which brings us here to the final bites of our medieval journey, where we take stock of all that's been chewed, slurped, foraged, and regretted. You sit by the fire stirring a familiar pot of something vaguely edible. It's not glamorous, just another round of barley and turnips. But there's comfort in the routine. Each meal in its way told a story, of seasons, of status, of stubborn survival. What you ate wasn't just about appetite, it was about identity, geography, and whether or not you offended the village baker last week. Bread, rough and sometimes full of stone dust, gave you strength. Ale, served at sunrise, kept you safe when the water wouldn't. Soups simmered endlessly, flavor shifting like the wind. Meat appeared like a comet, rare, exciting, and possibly dangerous. And fish. Well, you learned to love fish, or at least to tolerate it with holy resignation. You ate in silence with monks and laughed with neighbors over trenchers soaked in stew. You gathered nettles with care, eyed mushrooms with suspicion, and once made a perfectly questionable dinner out of acorns. You scraped honey from bark, sniffed suspect berries, and prayed over pots that smelled a little too adventurous. You learned how food was stored, buried, salted, smoked, dried, and sometimes just prayed over. You now know that a slice of cold eel pie is both a tragedy and a triumph. That almonds could turn into milk or fake eggs. That a single spoonful of sugar, if you could find it, could elevate your entire month. Historians still argue whether medieval food was bland or brilliant, sparse or sustaining. The truth? It was all of that. The peasant diet was repetitive but often nutritious. The noble table was abundant but not always enjoyable. Everyone, rich or poor, worked with what they had. They grew, gathered, cooked, shared, and hoped. And through all of it, they found small joys. The perfect plum. A cup of warm posset on a cold night. The first greens of spring after a long, gray winter. The unexpected gift of a pear from a neighbor's tree. Food wasn't just survival, it was ritual, rhythm, and sometimes a little bit of magic. Now, as you finish the last bite of your barley stew and wipe your spoon clean on a crust of bread, you exhale. Full. Not in the way a banquet fills you, but in the way a story does. The kind that sits warm in your chest and lingers, long after the dishes are cleared. The fire crackles softly. Outside, the wind rustles the thatch. You lean back on the wooden bench, hands resting on your lap, eyes half closed. Let's take a moment now and slow things down. You're still. The night presses gently against the windows, cool and quiet. Your breathing slows. Your belly is full but not heavy. Your thoughts drift like smoke curling up from a chimney, soft and aimless. Imagine the rhythm of a day winding down. The village is hushed. Chickens settled. Fires low. Somewhere a dog sighs in its sleep. The scent of herbs lingers faintly. Thyme, maybe mint. There's a spoon drying on the table and the last bit of bread waiting for tomorrow's hunger. Your body remembers the warmth of the stew. The simple, sustaining comfort of it. Nothing fancy. just enough, just right. The past fades, but the feeling remains. Of wooden bowls and candlelight. Of calloused hands passing bread. Of laughter floating over barley broth. You were there. You tasted that world. And now you carry it gently into your dreams. Let yourself drift now. No more gathering. No more stirring pots or chewing with caution. You've eaten well, by medieval standards astonishingly well. You've survived strange meats and meatless days. You've even outwitted suspicious mushrooms. That deserves rest. So close your eyes. Let the fire's memory warm you. Let the wind outside your window hum its quiet lullaby. And sleep, my friend. Sleep like someone who doesn't have to forage tomorrow. End of script. Sweet dreams.